The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical prayer as Natalie Hayes pushes through the ICU doors at 11:47 p.m., her scrub still damp from the rain outside. 6 months. 183 days of night shifts at St. Michael's in Atlanta, and the rhythm of this place has become muscle memory, the way the ventilators wheeze in synchronized intervals, the smell of antiseptic layered over something chemical and human, the particular silence that settles over critical care units when the world sleeps. Most of the staff respects her. The quiet ones always do. They see how her hands move without hesitation, how she can draw blood from a dehydrated septic patient on the first stick, how she reads a cardiac monitor the way other people read sentences. The charge nurse, Sandra, nods from the desk without needing to speak. They've developed the kind of wordless understanding that comes from working together in the dark. Natalie signs in and heads to the medication room, her movements economical and precise. She's learned that efficiency is invisible. People notice swagger and loudness, but they rarely notice someone who simply gets the work done without ceremony. Her scrub pocket shifts as she reaches for the Pyxis, and for a moment, the tarnished edge of something catches the fluorescent light. A challenge coin. Military-grade brass gone dull with time, worn smooth by years of being carried through places that don't appear on standard maps. She presses her fingers against it once, a habit now, and releases. 3 seconds. That's all she allows herself. The ICU is half full tonight. Beds 1 through 6 are occupied, a septic elderly woman in 1, a post-op cardiac patient in 3, a motorcycle accident victim in 5 who's been waiting for a bed at the trauma center for 36 hours. The machines breathe for those who can't. The monitors announce each heartbeat like a metronome counting toward either recovery or the moment when the beeping stops. Natalie moves through her charting with the kind of focused attention that means nothing gets missed. Blood pressures tracked to the decimal. Urine output measured in milliliters. The small numbers that tell the difference between a patient who's stabilizing and one who's running out of time. It's around 2 a.m. when the night shift finds its deepest rhythm. The hospital hallways beyond the ICU have gone quiet except for the occasional overhead page for a code somewhere in the building, the sound echoing with the hollow weight of emergency. Natalie is checking the ventilator settings on bed 3 when one of the newer nurses, Rachel, stops beside her with a clipboard. Transfer incoming, Rachel says. VA patient. Complex shrapnel injuries, mute presentation from throat trauma. Chen. Marcus Chen. They're bringing him up from emergency right now. Natalie's hand stills on the ventilator dial for exactly 1/2 second. The numbers in front of her blur slightly, then sharpen again as she forces her focus back into place. She does not turn to look at Rachel. She does not ask questions. She says, bed 7 is prepped. Prepped and ready. His records are printed. Kind of sparse though. Some of it's redacted. Rachel pauses, waiting for Natalie to respond. When she doesn't, Rachel continues to wherever she was going. Natalie finishes with bed 3 and walks to the supply closet, the small one at the end of the corridor where staff hide to breathe between emergencies. The door closes behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. Metal shelving rises on either side, stacked with dressings and for supplies and the small consumables that keep critical care functioning. She stands in the fluorescent-lit quiet, her back against the cold stainless steel, and reaches into her scrub pocket. The coin sits in her palm. Not large. Not ornate. Just brass that has been pressed and shaped and carried through 18 years and 4,000 miles of distance that official records do not measure in the conventional way. On one side, an insignia she could draw in her sleep. On the other, a date, 2004. Below that, a name that is not her own but might as well be. She can see him in her memory with the clarity that comes from trauma and consequence, an 8-year-old boy translating between languages that his throat was never meant to carry, standing in the wreckage of a building in Baghdad's Jolan district, his small hands shaking as he repeated words into a radio that connected back to soldiers who did not yet know his mother was dying 3 floors beneath the rubble. She had pulled him out. His mother had not made it. The promise she had made to a woman who was already gone, to watch over this boy, to keep him alive, to make sure his survival meant something, that promise was 34 meters away in bed 7, unconscious and broken in a way that required more than her nursing license to understand. She presses the coin into her palm hard enough that the edges leave marks in her skin. This is not a time to think. This is a time to work. She releases the coin, slides it back into her pocket, and steps out of the supply closet. The lights buzz their fluorescent hymn. The monitors sing their mechanical warning songs. The night shift continues its patient, endless labor. It's 4:12 in the morning when Dr. Richard Caldwell arrives for early rounds. He has been the unit director of St. Michael's ICU for 15 years, and the atmosphere of the unit shifts when he enters it like weather changing before a storm. He's in his early 60s, wearing an Italian wool suit that costs more than most nurses make in a week, his tie precisely knotted, his hair styled with the kind of intentional grooming that comes from understanding that authority is partly theater. He's followed by his residents, 4 of them this morning, all sharp-eyed younger doctors who have learned to survive by mirroring his confidence and laughing at his jokes on cue. He walks through the unit the way a conductor walks across a stage. Natalie is charting at the desk when his eyes find her. She's folding a blanket that a patient requested, her movements unhurried, her face neutral. She does not look up when he stops nearby, but she knows he's looking at her the way a predator assesses competition, not with hunger, but with the kind of territorial calculation that precedes dominance displays. "Ah, night shift," he says, his voice carrying across the unit in a way that makes several staff members glance up. "Tell me something. How long have you been working in critical care?" Natalie folds the blanket. Crease. Fold. Crease. Fold. 6 months at St. Michael's. 15 years total. The answer is written in her personnel file, which he has almost certainly read. "I was beginning to think we'd hired a nurse," he continues, turning to his residents with the expression of someone about to deliver a punchline. "Turns out we got a glorified candy striper." The residents laugh exactly when they're supposed to. "You know what I said when I saw your application? I bet you quit within a week. I bet the second you see what real medicine looks like, you'll remember you wanted to work in retail." Natalie places the folded blanket on the shelf. The fluorescent lights buzz like insects trapped behind the panels. One of the residents is watching her face, waiting for a reaction. Professional pride wounded. Defensive response. Something to give Caldwell permission to keep pushing. She turns and makes eye contact with Caldwell for exactly 2 seconds. No tremor in her hands. No heat in her face. Just a flat, clinical stare that acknowledges he has spoken without acknowledging that his words have weight. "The septic patient in bed 2 needs a repeat lactate," she says. "And bed 3's drip rate is running slow." She walks past his group toward the medication room. His expression darkens slightly, not because she has objected to his mockery, but because she has not acknowledged it at all. That is worse than a defensive response. That is dismissal. She can feel his frustration radiating like heat as she passes. The morning light begins its slow invasion through the ICU windows around 6 a.m., painting everything in shades of grey and exhaustion. Natalie is standing at the medication cart when Caldwell appears with his entourage, moving toward the cafeteria break area. He's carrying a coffee cup and still talking, still performing for his audience, still establishing his dominance through narrative. She's pulling medications for her patients, checking names and doses against the monitors, when he walks past carrying a breakfast tray from the cafeteria, eggs, toast, fruit salad in a plastic container. Their trajectories intersect in the narrow space where the medication cart sits near the desk. Caldwell does not hesitate. Does not pretend it's an accident. He simply knocks the tray from her hands like a child swatting at something that annoys him. The plastic containers hit the floor. Scrambled eggs scatter across the tile. The toast slides under a rolling stool. The coffee cup shatters and spills its contents in a spreading brown stain that smells bitter and hot. The residents watch. Sandra at the desk looks up from her charting. The other nurses stop moving. The room does not go silent, the machines continue their monotonous symphony, but something in the atmosphere crystallizes into something harder and colder. "Oh, clumsy," Caldwell says. Pick that up, sweetheart. Real medicine isn't for the soft-hearted. He drops Marcus Chen's chart at her feet on top of the scattered breakfast, pages fluttering. And when you're done with that, familiarize yourself with our new transfer. Though something tells me you might not be equipped to handle the complexity. He walks toward the cafeteria with his residents trailing behind him like remora fish following a shark. One of them doesn't laugh. The others do. Natalie kneels to gather the scattered pages and debris. Her movements are deliberate. Her hands are steady. She is not trembling. She is not angry in any way that shows. She is simply kneeling on the tile floor of the ICU at 6:43 in the morning, collecting fragments of a breakfast she hadn't finished and pages of medical history that belonged to a boy she once promised to protect. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly. Her throat tightens imperceptibly. Everything stays locked inside where it belongs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she recognized the name on the chart before she opened it. The worst part was that the universe, with its particular sense of cosmic irony, had decided to bring her face to face with a promise she had made 20 years ago to a dying woman in a building that no longer existed. The worst part was that Marcus Chen was downstairs in the emergency department right now, being prepped for transfer, his medical file in her hands, his future somehow tangled in hers, and she had exactly 40 minutes before he arrived in bed 7 to figure out how to be the nurse he needed while maintaining the cover identity that was keeping her here in the first place. She finished gathering the broken pieces and stood, the chart pressed against her chest. The chart felt heavier than paper should feel. Natalie pressed it against her chest as the elevator doors slid open on the ICU floor, the antiseptic smell hitting her nostrils like a punch she'd learned to absorb years ago in operating rooms where the blood never quite washed out of the tile grout. 40 minutes. That was the timeline naval intelligence had given her before Marcus Chen's gurney would roll through those doors, before she'd have to look at the face of a boy she'd pulled from rubble 2 decades ago and pretend he was just another patient. She didn't make it 10 steps before Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the nurse's station like a scalpel finding bone. "Gentlemen, gather round." He stood at the center of the station, his white coat pristine in a way that meant he hadn't actually worked a trauma in 3 weeks. 4 residents flanked him, their posture shifting from exhaustion to attention the moment their director spoke. That was the theater of it, the way power in hospitals moved like weather systems, low pressure gathering around certain people, high pressure dispersing around others. Caldwell had mastered the meteorology. "Let's take bets. I'm giving the glorified Candy Striper here 1 week. 7 days, maximum, before she realizes this isn't a feel-good Hallmark movie." Natalie's jaw clenched imperceptibly. Just a muscle twitch, the kind only combat-trained personnel would recognize. She continued writing in Chen's transfer file without looking up, her pen moving at the exact same speed it had moved the second before Caldwell opened his mouth. The residents laughed, tentative, looking for permission from their director the way animals look for an alpha's approval before eating. "Real ICU nursing requires backbone," Caldwell continued, loud enough for the entire unit to hear. Loud enough for the nurses at bed 3 and 5 to pause their work and listen. Not participation trophies. Not good intentions. Backbone. He smiled at his residents like he'd just delivered a TED talk instead of mocking a woman whose hands had sutured wounds under fire while people were trying to kill her. "I'd give her more time, but she'll probably request a transfer after the first code." Natalie filed Chen's chart into the slot at the nurse's station. Her movements were economical, precise. A surgeon's hands, that's what her naval intelligence medical advisor had told her during training. Keep your hands moving like you know exactly what you're doing, because hesitation reads as doubt, and doubt is what gives away cover identities. She turned and walked past Caldwell's table without meeting his eyes, and she felt his satisfaction like a weight pressing on her back. He thought he'd won that exchange. He thought her silence meant surrender. He had no idea what silence actually meant when it came from someone who'd spent 18 months learning to breathe through panic attacks in a basement in Kandahar. The cafeteria at lunch was a different kind of theater. Natalie carried her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, coffee black, past the table where Caldwell sat with the hospital's CEO and 2 board members. She was 2 tables away when Caldwell's voice rose again, this time directed at her like a spotlight. Hayes. The sedation protocol on the new VA transfer. The PTSD case in bed 7. She stopped. The challenge coin pressed against her ribs under her scrubs, right over her heart, a weight she'd been carrying since Baghdad fell. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking like old bones. His records indicate paradoxical agitation with benzodiazepines, Natalie said. Her voice was steady, controlled like a pressure valve that lets out exactly the right amount of steam and no more. I'd recommend tapering the current protocol, Anne. I don't recall asking for your recommendation, sweetheart. He stood. The movement was theatrical, designed to draw attention. His hand swept across the table in a casual arc, but there was nothing casual about it. Her tray lifted with emotion, soup bowl, sandwich plate, coffee cup, apple, and the whole thing cascaded onto the tile floor. Liquid spread across the white surface like a crime scene, orange and brown mixing. The cafeteria went silent the way cafeterias do when a predator has made a kill and everyone else is deciding whether to run or stay still. Caldwell pulled Chen's chart from under his arm. He dropped it at her feet. Pick that up. Then maybe review what your scope of practice actually includes. Natalie knelt. Her knees touched the wet floor, and the cold seeped through her scrubs. She gathered the scattered pages, her hands moving with the same mechanical precision they used when performing chest compressions. The soup smelled like chicken broth and humiliation. She straightened, chart reassembled, and walked past Caldwell to the trash bins. She could feel 300 eyes on her back, waiting to see if she would cry, if her voice would crack, if she would finally break the way broken people were supposed to break. She disposed of the tray. She walked to the employee restroom. She washed her hands. Then she returned to the floor. 20 minutes later, she was in the supply closet. Door closed. Forehead pressed against cold metal shelving that had seen 17 years of hospital supplies rotate through and out. Her hand gripped the challenge coin hard enough to leave an impression in her palm, Washington's profile etched backward into her skin. The coin was tarnished, darkened by humidity and the dust of a city that no longer existed the way it had when she was 23 years old, running through its streets in Kevlar and body armor, holding the hand of a boy whose mother was dying under concrete. 1 breath. 2. The trembling wasn't fear, fear was information, and she'd learned long ago how to file information away in compartments that didn't leak. The trembling was restraint. It was the effort of keeping a Master Chief Petty Officer locked inside a night shift nurse for the sake of a mission that had already cost her more than she could calculate. She pocketed the coin and returned to the floor. That night, Marcus Chen arrived on a gurney at 22:13 hours. Natalie took report from the transport medic, her eye scanning the face of the grown man being wheeled through the ICU doors. 20 years had changed him, filled out his frame, added scars she could see even through the sedation. But his hands were the same, long-fingered and still, the hands of someone who'd learned to be quiet before speech became impossible. The medic gave her the basics: motor vehicle collision, shrapnel wounds to anterior chest and left leg, significant respiratory compromise. We intubated in the field, got him on propofol drip, 2 liters normal saline running, pain managed with fentanyl patches. He paused. His emergency contact is listed as deceased, mother, listed as killed in 2004. No other family on file. Natalie's pen paused for exactly half a second. Then it continued writing. Her training had taught her that 30 seconds of grief is 30 seconds of vulnerability, and vulnerability is how intelligence operatives get killed or compromised. She was here for one reason: Chen's case had flagged something in the naval database, a pattern of medication diversion through the VA system that suggested someone was skimming opioids. Caldwell's hospital was the distribution point. Naval intelligence needed documentation. They needed names. They needed evidence. And they needed her to be invisible while she gathered it. She assigned Chen to bed 7, the corner position where the monitors faced away from the main hallway. She began her documentation immediately, photographing every medication administration, every chart entry, every dosage that went in or didn't. Her real nursing license, issued under a cover identity by Naval Intelligence's Medical Cover Program, held up to routine scrutiny. But Caldwell was beginning to hover, appearing at odd hours, his questions wrapped in false concern. On night 4, he appeared at 3:15, just as she was documenting Chen's current medication status. His presence moved through the ICU like a pressure system, air molecules shifting, tension rising. "You're very thorough, Nurse Hayes." She looked up from her charting. Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It never did. Just my standard protocol, Doctor. Almost like you're looking for something." He leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. "I'm going to be honest with you. Something about your background doesn't quite add up. Your references are too clean. Your work history is too perfect. No one is that perfect. I'm careful with my patients. Yes. Perhaps too careful." He straightened. "I'm requesting a full background verification. Just routine. Shouldn't be a problem if everything is as it appears." He walked away before she could respond, and Natalie's hand found the challenge coin. Her fingers traced Washington's profile as she calculated the timeline. Background checks took 48 hours minimum. Naval Intelligence had protocols for cover story verification. They would plant documents, references, digital footprints, the whole architecture of a false identity would hold up to scrutiny. It had held up to worse. But it wouldn't hold up if he was determined enough. If he kept asking questions. If he had the right connections. The next evening, Chen's sedation was increased. Natalie discovered the order in the system, Caldwell's signature, dated that morning. She checked the chart notes. No clinical justification. No documentation of increased agitation. He'd simply overridden her careful, measured protocol with something designed to keep Chen more compliant, more sedated, more manageable. Something, she thought, that would make him less likely to report medication inconsistencies if he woke up aware enough to notice them. She adjusted the drip back to previous levels, documenting the change with precise notation, patient presenting with decreased oxygenation saturation at current sedation level. Reduced propofol rate per weaning protocol. O2 sat improved from 89% to 94% post-adjustment. The words were true. The implication was neutral. No one reading it would understand that she was documenting Caldwell's sabotage and her countermeasure simultaneously. Caldwell appeared 30 minutes later. The night shift nurse called her to the station before she could reach Chen's bedside. "Did you alter my orders?" His voice was ice, controlled ice, the kind that causes frostbite without fire. "I'm looking at your documentation. You decreased his propofol. Patient safety required it. His saturation was dropping. Patient safety is my determination, not yours." He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, like he was trying to dominate the air around him. "You're on thin ice, sweetheart. One more cowboy decision and you're done. Do you understand me?" Natalie met his eyes. She said nothing. Her silence was a mirror, and what Caldwell saw in it was his own conviction that she was just a nurse overstepping her authority, not a Master Chief Petty Officer running an intelligence operation under his nose. He turned and walked away. Behind him, Chen's monitors beeped their irregular rhythm, blood pressure fluctuating, oxygen saturation still not stable, heart rate elevated. The ticking clock had begun. 23 years of naval special warfare training had taught Natalie how to function in exactly this state: too much information, too little time, and the knowledge that one wrong move would compromise everything. She returned to Chen's bedside and began her assessment. His vitals told a story Caldwell couldn't read and wouldn't listen to anyway. She had hours, maybe less, before something broke. And when it did, she would have to decide whether to hide or reveal exactly who she was. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar monotone as Natalie pushed the medication cart toward the elevators. Third shift had ended 40 minutes ago, but she lingered, checking Chen's vitals one last time before day staff arrived. His oxygen sat at 94%. Stable. She'd learned not to trust stability in hospitals. Stability was a pause between catastrophes. Her phone buzzed. Patricia from HR administrative floor. Now. The elevator climbed with the speed of a dying heartbeat. Natalie knew what this was. Caldwell had moved from public humiliation to strategic escalation. The network was activating. She could feel it the way combat veterans feel incoming artillery, a pressure change in the air before the explosion. Patricia's office overlooked the parking lot where ambulances arrived in flashes of red. The HR director sat behind a desk organized with surgical precision, 3 pens aligned, folders stacked by date, a single plant positioned exactly where a visitor would see it. Normal hospital theater. Natalie had learned to read institutions the way soldiers read terrain. "Natalie, thanks for coming up." Patricia's voice had changed since Natalie's interview 6 months ago. Warmer then. Now it carried the careful distance of someone reading from a script written by someone else. "Dr. Caldwell has raised some concerns about your clinical judgment." Natalie Saturday. Hands folded. Face neutral, the composure of someone who'd learned decades ago that expressions were ammunition in the wrong hands. "What kind of concerns?" Her voice was steady, deferential. The mask stayed fitted. Patricia opened a folder. Inside, a report Caldwell had obviously spent the night preparing. His handwriting, aggressive and slanted, filled 3 pages. He's requesting a formal peer review. Says you've overstepped protocol multiple times. There's also mention of some unconventional approaches to patient care. "I follow all protocol, Ms. Patricia." "I believe you." Patricia didn't sound convinced. "But we need to verify your credentials. It's standard procedure when questions arise about clinical competence." She slid a form across the desk. "Background verification. Credential audit. Authorization for educational institution contact." Natalie's hands didn't tremble as she signed. They were steady, hands that had held pressure dressings in Baghdad, hands that had carried a child through gunfire. They didn't betray her now. "We'll need to contact your nursing school," Patricia continued. "Get official transcripts, verify your degree, licensure history. Should be routine." The transcripts existed. Naval intelligence had constructed them with the same meticulous precision they brought to every cover identity. They would pass surface examination. Cursory verification. But Caldwell wasn't ordering cursory verification. He was ordering deep scrutiny, the kind that looked beneath surfaces. The kind that asked questions when timelines didn't quite match, or when you called the wrong department name, or when you used terminology that was technically correct but not how someone from that school would naturally speak it. "How long will this take?" Natalie asked. "A week, maybe 2. Dr. Caldwell is also requesting an external investigator. Someone from outside the hospital to review his concerns independently." Patricia closed the folder. She wasn't meeting Natalie's eyes now. "He's very concerned about patient safety." The words were Caldwell's. Natalie heard his voice in them, the theatrical concern of someone convinced he was protecting the hospital from a threat he'd invented. He'd probably used that exact phrasing on the phone already, whatever phone call had prompted this meeting. She left the administrative floor at 9:14 in the morning. The stairwell was empty. Natalie sat on the landing between the 4th and 3rd floors for 4 minutes, her back against the concrete wall. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she'd stopped allowing herself in 2003, when she learned that grief was a sound that carried too far in the dark. Instead, she let her mind catalog the exposure vectors. Background check, surface level, probably fine. Nursing school verification, naval intelligence had prepared for that. External investigator, that was the risk. That was the point where someone paid to be thorough would start asking questions about inconsistencies, about gaps in her story, about the way her references knew to say exactly the right things in exactly the right way. But there was something else. Something that had happened in the last 8 hours that Natalie didn't know yet. In the parking garage across the street, Dr. Caldwell stood beside his pearl grey Lexus with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, controlled, the way he sounded when he believed no one was listening. "Roger, I need the investigator here by Friday." "Yes, the one who handled the Milwaukee case." Caldwell had attended Duke with a man named Harrison Pierce, former hospital administrator, current board chairman, the kind of connection that accumulated power over decades like interest on capital. "She's a liar. I don't know what her game is, but she's hiding something. You can feel it. I've got 15 years of instinct here, and every instinct says this woman doesn't belong in my ICU." The investigator he was calling had specialized in credential fraud cases. He was thorough. He was expensive. He was exactly the kind of threat that made extraction protocols suddenly relevant. Caldwell ended the call and sat in the Lexus, hands on the steering wheel, face flushed with the satisfaction of a man who'd activated his arsenal. He didn't know that his request was about to trigger something he couldn't control. Natalie was in Chen's room when the first tremor came. Not a physical tremor, those belong to weaker people, but a seismic shift in institutional pressure. She was changing his dressing, documenting the shrapnel wound patterns with clinical precision. The injuries were consistent with IED blast fragmentation, the same metallurgic signature she'd seen in rubble outside Fallujah. Same wound depth patterns. Same infection vectors. Same story written in torn tissue. Chen's eyes were open. Aware. Tracking her movements the way a person learns to communicate when their voice is stolen from them. She'd finished the third dressing layer when his hand moved. Fingers formed a shape slowly, deliberately. The index and middle fingers curled, thumb extended. The hand signal for friendly they taught Iraqi interpreters in 2004, the sign that meant someone was safe, that you could lower your weapon. Natalie's breath caught for exactly half a second. Just enough time for her nervous system to recognize him, not as Marcus Chen, mute veteran, but as the 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble, the child who'd watched his mother die in a hospital in Baghdad and asked her, in Arabic, if she would keep watching over him. She returned the signal. Thumb up. Index and middle fingers extended. Friendly. Chen's eyes widened with recognition so profound that the cardiac monitor beeped faster, his heart rate climbing from 82 to 98 in 3 seconds. His hand gripped hers with desperate strength, and Natalie felt the 20-year arc of their separation collapse into this single moment, a moment she'd trained never to allow, a moment that put everything at risk. Then the alarms began. Not the soft warning beeps of routine monitoring. The acute, escalating wail of a monitor recognizing catastrophic change. Chen's oxygen saturation numbers dropped like a bird shot from the sky, 94, 88, 79. His blood pressure collapsed, 120 over 80 to 90 over 50 in less than 6 seconds. The cardiac waveform on the monitor showed the unmistakable pattern of cardiac tamponade, fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing his heart, choking the organ with every beat. Natalie hit the code button without hesitation. Her voice was steady as she announced the emergency into the intercom. Code blue, ICU, bed 4. Cardiac tamponade suspected. ETA for physician-led response. The intercom crackled. Supervisor's voice. Dr. Caldwell is in clinic. ETA for minutes. For minutes. Chen had less than one. His neck veins were distending now, visible as dark cords beneath pale skin. His lips were taking on a blue-gray cast, cyanosis, the body's visible surrender to hypoxia. His hand released hers, fingers going slack, and Natalie watched the light in his eyes begin to dim with the same progression she'd memorized across decades of medical work. Pain is information. That's what they taught you in tactical combat medicine. Pain tells you what's broken. But absence of pain, the absence of movement, the absence of response, that told you something worse. It told you time was running out. Caldwell had standing orders. No invasive procedures without physician supervision. No needles in the chest unless a doctor authorized it. The pericardiocentesis, the needle insertion into the pericardial sac to withdraw the fluid that was killing Chen, was his territory. His protocol. His authority. Breaking it meant immediate termination. Exposure as someone willing to violate procedure. Proof of the recklessness Caldwell had already accused her of. Following it meant watching Chen's heart arrest beneath her hands. Natalie opened the emergency equipment drawer and withdrew a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Her hands were perfectly steady. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear was information too, and she'd learned in Baghdad that the people most likely to live were the ones who could feel terror and move anyway. The heart monitor showed 60 beats per minute now. 60. Critical thresholds collapsing toward the final flat line. Natalie prepped the insertion site, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical gateway she'd been trained to find in darkness and in blood. Her fingers found the space between ribs with muscle memory that belonged to another lifetime, another identity. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that in the supply closet 2 floors up, Dr. Caldwell's investigation was accelerating through channels he'd already activated. The external investigator was being called. The nursing school verification was pending. The federal audit, the one Caldwell had requested as part of his credential review process, the one that audited medication logs and staff behavior patterns, was about to begin. And somewhere in those files, in the administrative machinery Caldwell had set in motion, a signature would appear on medication logs that didn't belong there. A signature that would unravel everything Caldwell had built over 15 years. But Natalie didn't know that yet. She only knew that Chen's oxygen saturation had dropped to 53%, that his pupils were fixed and dilated, that she had less than 90 seconds before his brain began dying from oxygen deprivation. She raised the needle and began to move with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd made this choice before, to break the rules, to risk everything, to choose one person over the institution. The needle advanced toward his chest. Chen's chest tightened. His monitors screamed the warning before his body did, the relentless climb of pressure, the collapse of his cardiac output, the slow suffocation of a man whose own blood was turning against him. Natalie heard it first. Not the alarms. The silence underneath them. That particular quiet that comes when a body is dying and the machines haven't caught up yet. She moved before anyone else in the unit registered the change. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing the heart. She'd seen it once before in a forward operating base in Fallujah, watched a trauma surgeon drain 300 cubic centimeters of blood from a Marine's pericardium while mortar fire hammered the walls outside. The procedure was muscle memory now, not learned but lived, encoded in her hands the way some people carry prayers. She grabbed the crash cart. Her movements were liquid precision, each motion flowing into the next without hesitation or doubt. No physician present. No permission requested. No time for protocol. Natalie pulled a spinal needle from the sterile supply, her fingers finding it in the dark the way they would find a light switch in a burning building. She prepped Chen's chest with betadine in 10 seconds, the cold orange sting of the antiseptic, the smell cutting through the recycled air of the ICU like a blade. Her hands located the anatomical landmarks the way a musician finds strings on an instrument played 1,000 times, 5th intercostal space, just lateral to the sternum. Palpate. Mark. Breathe. The needle advanced at a 45-degree angle toward his left shoulder. She felt the resistance of tissue giving way, muscle and fascia parting like water. Then the distinct pop, the unmistakable sensation of pericardial penetration, that subtle give when the needle breaks through the last membrane between life and death. Dark blood filled the syringe. 120 cubic centimeters of fluid that was crushing Chen's heart, drowning him from the inside out. His blood pressure stabilized immediately. The monitors climbed, oxygen saturation rising from 68 to 75 to 82 to 88. The terrifying arithmetic of survival, 1 percentage point at a time. Natalie withdrew the needle with the same steady pressure she'd applied when inserting it. Applied pressure. Disposed of sharps. Her hands never trembled. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. She was charting when Dr. Caldwell arrived with the code team, his face already flushed with the anticipation of action he would not need to take. She didn't look up from the monitor. Chen's vital signs were climbing. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Caldwell's expression shifted. The white that flooded his face wasn't relief. It was rage, the particular fury of a man accustomed to control discovering he'd lost it. "What did you do?" His voice was quiet. "Dangerous." Natalie met his eyes. "Emergency pericardiocentesis. Cardiac tamponade." He would have arrested in under a minute. Without physician supervision. Each word was a weapon. Without authorization. "He's alive." Caldwell's voice rose to fill the entire ICU. "You just ended your career. Get out of my unit. Now." Natalie finished charting. Disposed of the needle properly. Washed her hands. The ritual of protocol, even now, even as the room held its breath around her. She didn't rush. She didn't shake. She moved with the same composure she'd carried through every crisis, every impossible choice, every moment when the only thing standing between a person and death was the decision to act. 2 hours later, HR escorted her out of St. Michael's with Patricia trailing behind, unable to meet her eyes. The words came in the form of a suspension letter, typed and official and somehow smaller than the weight they carried. "Dr. Caldwell has filed formal complaints," Patricia said, not looking at Natalie. "Practicing beyond scope of a nurse's license. Insubordination. Reckless endangerment. The external investigator arrives tomorrow to review your credentials and licensure. You're suspended pending investigation." Caldwell had moved fast. The network he'd spent 15 years cultivating, the board chairman who owed him a favor, the other physicians who'd watched him wield power and learned to respect it, they'd all answered his call. Natalie's background check had been accelerated, her credentials scrutinized, her nursing license examined for inconsistencies that would justify what he already knew he wanted to do, destroy her before she could expose him. Natalie entered her locker. An extra pair of scrubs. The tarnished challenge coin, the one she'd kept in her scrub pocket through every shift, the metal worn smooth by her thumb during the 3 a.m. moments when doubt crept in. A photograph she kept face down, a promise made to a dying woman in a city that seemed to exist in another lifetime entirely. She signed the suspension paperwork without reading it. She already knew what it said. She surrendered her badge. The weight of it, just a rectangle of plastic, felt heavier than it had any right to be. Walking out through the loading dock at 3 in the afternoon, she passed the hospital laundry. The industrial hum of the washers, the chemical smell of hospital detergent cutting through everything else. She didn't stop. Not yet. But at midnight, she returned. The service entrance was easy to find. She'd mapped every blind spot in this building 6 months ago, had known the security gaps before she ever put on the scrubs. The building was nearly empty, the skeleton crew of night shift staff moving through their routines, no one paying attention to a woman in dark clothes entering through a door that was technically restricted. The laundry room was all industrial machinery and heat and the smell of industrial bleach. The washers hummed their mechanical rhythm like the ventilators upstairs, like the heart monitors that would keep beating even without her there to hear them. She pulled her scrubs from her bag, the fabric still holding the scent of antiseptic and betadine and the soap they used on the ICU floor. She folded them slowly, precisely, the way the Navy had taught her 23 years ago during that first week of boot camp when they taught you that control started with the smallest things, how you folded your uniform, how you made your rack, how you maintained composure when the world was chaos. Each crease exact. Military corners, even though no one would ever inspect them again. This was rock bottom. Not the suspension. Not the humiliation or the professional destruction or the careful dismantling of a cover identity that had taken months to construct. Rock bottom was standing in a laundry room at midnight, folding scrubs that no longer belonged to her, knowing that Chen would wake tomorrow without the one person in this hospital who understood what he'd survived. Knowing that somewhere on the 5th floor, his monitors were beeping steadily, his vital signs holding because of her intervention, his body slowly being poisoned by someone she could no longer stop. knowing that she'd saved his life tonight and lost everything in the doing. She placed the folded scrubs on the shelf. They looked small, somehow. Diminished. Just fabric now, no longer a weapon or a tool or the uniform of someone with the authority to act. The loading dock was empty when she left. The night air of Atlanta was thick and warm, the kind of humidity that clung to your skin like water. Above, somewhere in the darkness, St. Michael's rose against the Atlanta skyline. Lights still burning in the ICU. Monitors still running. Caldwell probably still in his office, making calls, consolidating his victory, ensuring that the threat had been neutralized. He had no idea what was about to land on the rooftop. The Black Hawk helicopter descended through the pre-dawn darkness like a predatory bird folding its wings. The rotor wash hammered against St. Michael's rooftop, rattling windows 8 stories below, shaking the entire north wing awake at 5:27 a.m. For figures in dress uniforms deplaned before the rotors stopped spinning, Navy personnel moving with the economical precision of operators who didn't waste motion on anything except purpose. They carried no weapons. They carried something far more destructive: documentation. The security chief, himself a retired Marine named Holloway, watched them cross the rooftop from the stairwell camera feed. His hands went still on the keyboard. He'd seen that gate before. That bearing. That was active duty command structure, and they were moving with the focused intensity of a unit executing a predetermined operation. He picked up his radio. Administration, this is security. We have Navy brass inbound. For officers, dress uniforms. ETA 3 minutes to the executive wing. Roger Chen, the board chairman, was still reviewing Caldwell's termination paperwork when his secretary informed him that 4 military personnel had just entered the building and were requesting access to conference room A. His first instinct was irritation, some veteran complaint, probably something administrative, something that could have been handled through proper channels. He had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. Dr. Caldwell sat at the head of the polished oak table, his prepared remarks about Natalie's unprofessional conduct and credential irregularities arranged in neat index cards before him. He'd already called the hospital's legal counsel. He'd already drafted the incident report. He'd already consolidated his victory in his mind, turning it over like a precious stone, admiring how completely he'd eliminated the threat to his authority. The external investigator was due to submit findings by end of week. Everything was moving according to plan. The lead officer entered first, a 2-star admiral with silver eagles on his shoulders and a face carved from granite. Behind him came a naval intelligence officer in dress blues, a JAG representative, and a lieutenant commander whose uniform bore the insignia of NCIS. The room's air pressure changed. Not metaphorically. Caldwell felt it physically, a shift in atmospheric density that made his throat constrict. Dr. Richard Caldwell. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, not louder than conversation, simply unavoidable. I'm Rear Admiral Marcus Holloway, Naval Special Warfare Command. I need to inform you that Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, assigned to deep cover operations at this facility, has completed her mission parameters. You're being briefed on classified operations and personnel, which requires your immediate security clearance acknowledgement. Caldwell's face went pale. His mouth opened. No sound emerged. Master Chief Hayes, the Admiral continued, 23 years of active service. Naval Special Warfare Specialization. Deployed with SEAL Team coordination to Baghdad, Helmand, and Loga. 2 Silver Stars for Valor. Multiple classified operations spanning 2 decades. He slid a sealed personnel folder across the table. You're not authorized to open that. But you are required to know that the nursing license you questioned is not only real, it's issued under federal operational protocols and carries full medical and legal authority. The JAG officer stepped forward, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd spent her career building cases that couldn't fail. Dr. Caldwell, I need to inform you that your actions over the past 6 hours have triggered a federal investigation into your conduct. When you requested an external credential review, you activated mandatory reporting protocols that required audit of all related clinical documentation. I don't understand what this is about, Caldwell managed, his voice thin. She performed an unauthorized procedure. The pericardiocentesis, the Admiral interrupted flatly. The one that extracted 120 cubic centimeters of blood from the pericardial sac and prevented acute cardiac tamponade. The one that saved Sergeant Marcus Chen's life in approximately 90 seconds. He placed another folder on the table. Your sedation protocol would have killed him in under 4 minutes. Master Chief Hayes documented everything. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, that almost subliminal electronic whine that only registers in profound silence. Furthermore, the NCIS officer said, in reviewing your clinical records as part of the credential audit, irregularities were discovered in controlled substance administration dating back 18 months. Fentanyl, morphine, benzodiazepine signed out under your authorization but not administered to patients. The external investigator you hired has submitted preliminary findings to the DEA. Caldwell's face flushed red, then drained of color entirely, cycling through a spectrum of panic that made his 15 years of institutional authority feel like it was evaporating in real time. That's not, I can explain. Your signature appears on 847 discrepant medication logs, the JAG officer said. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Master Chief Hayes documented each instance, photographed records, and compiled evidence of a coordinated medication diversion operation spanning the entire period of her assignment. That evidence is currently with federal prosecutors in the Northern District of Georgia. Roger Chen stood abruptly. The board chairman who'd appointed Caldwell, who'd protected him, who'd attended his Christmas parties, stepped back as if physical distance could separate him from criminal liability. Richard, what the hell? The investigation you initiated ended your career, the Admiral said, not unkindly. Master Chief Hayes didn't expose you. You exposed yourself by forcing the very audit mechanisms designed to catch exactly what you've been doing. He gathered the folders with methodical precision. You're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending criminal charges. Your medical license is being referred to the State Board for emergency revocation. This facility's legal team will be contacting you within the hour. The lead officer was already walking toward the door, his team following in perfect formation, the kind of synchronized movement that comes from operating together through genuine danger. The Admiral paused at the threshold. Master Chief Hayes is cleared to return to duty status at this facility, pending her approval. She answers to me now. Not to you. Then they were gone, leaving Caldwell sitting at the head of his own table, his career spreading out before him like a body on an autopsy slab. In the ICU, Natalie stood at the window of Marcus Chen's room, watching the sunrise paint Atlanta in shades of copper and gold. She'd changed into her dress uniform in the administrative bathroom, blue so sharp they could cut, ribbons arranged in order of precedence, rank insignia gleaming like truth finally breaking through surface tension. The challenge coin was still in her hand, the twin to the one she'd given his mother in Baghdad 20 years ago. The metal was worn smooth from 2 decades of being carried, of being gripped in moments when the weight of promises threatened to crush her. Chen was awake, sitting upright in the hospital bed, the new text-to-speech device mounted on a flexible arm near his shoulder. The voice synthesizer was clinical and precise, but it carried the weight of his own story translated into sound. You came back, the device said, his fingers moving across the touch interface with labored precision. Each word was a small victory. He'd regained some function in his right hand, the tremors from his initial injuries gradually subsiding as his body continued healing. Told you I would, Natalie said quietly. She pinned the challenge coin to his hospital gown above his heart, letting her fingers linger for just a moment. The metal caught the morning light, throwing fractured reflections across his chest. His hand came up and gripped her wrist, not with weakness, but with the kind of strength that comes from someone who understands exactly how close he came to not being alive to do it. 20 years, he said through the device. You kept the promise. Your mother was a hero, Natalie replied. An interpreter in a war zone. She trusted me with your life and asked me to watch over you. That's not a promise you break. That's a blood oath. Out in the hallway, staff members began appearing, nurses who'd witnessed Caldwell's cruelty, who'd watched him throw Natalie's tray to the floor, who'd seen her accept humiliation without flinching. They stood in the doorway now, seeing her in full uniform, seeing the insignia, understanding that every moment of composure she'd maintained had been the choice of a warrior, not the weakness of a subordinate. Patricia from Human Resources approached hesitantly, her voice small. "Master Chief, on behalf of the hospital, I want to apologize for the way you were treated." "The apology," Natalie said, her voice carrying the authority of command, "isn't for me. It's for every veteran who comes through those doors expecting care and receives contempt instead." She turned back to Chen, and her expression softened, the mask dropping just slightly in this private space where the war was finally over. "The mission's complete," she said quietly. "The medication diversion ring is shut down. 3 other sites are under investigation. The patients whose deaths were preventable, their families will have answers now." "Where you go?" Chen asked, the synthesized voice still mechanical but carrying the weight of real loss. "Wherever the Navy sends me next." She allowed herself a smile so small it barely registered. "But I'll know where you are. And I'll know you're safe." 6 hours later, as Natalie walked through the main entrance of St. Michael's in her dress uniform, morning sun slanting across the lobby, she paused at the glass doors. Down the hallway, through an office window, she could see workers removing Caldwell's name placard from his door. In 6 months, he'd go from running an ICU to teaching CPR basics at a community college for $15 an hour, the only medical work any licensing board would ever let him do again. The door slid open automatically, and Natalie stepped into the light. A black SUV idled at the curb, the driver's face neutral, the destination classified. The next mission. The next mute veteran in a hospital somewhere, the next system that needed breaking, the next promise that needed keeping. She paused for one final moment, looking back at the ICU floor where she'd spent 6 months invisible. Then forward. Always forward. Behind her, in room for 12, Marcus Chen sat holding a tarnished challenge coin, the one his mother had held as she died, the one a Navy SEAL had placed in her palm with a whispered promise. 20 years later, she'd kept it. Not because she was required to. Because some oaths transcend rank and uniform and time itself. Because some promises are the only thing that makes you human. If someone you trust suddenly reveals they're far more than they seemed, that's your sign that the quiet people are often the strongest. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories about hidden heroes and real consequences. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full strength, tell us about it in the comments below.